"Ma'am, you may be in the wrong line." The agent at gate G12 held the boarding pass between two fingers. The way a man handles a document he has already decided is false, he did not scan it. He did not glance at the screen 6 inches behind him. He tilted the paper toward the ceiling lights, slowly, with the patience of a jeweler refusing a stone. Chicago O'Hare International on a winter Tuesday morning. Concourse G of Meridian Airways, first-class boarding. Where the marble had been engineered 9 winters earlier not to echo, it echoed now. 4 meters behind him, behind a sheet of polished glass, a turbine model rested on a low display pedestal. The brass plate at the base of the pedestal read, Lead Design Engineer C. Mercer. 6 paces to the agent's left, outside the velvet rope, a man in a gray contractor's coat stood with one hand resting on the shoulder of a small girl. The girl held a metal keychain in her left fist. When the agent laughed, she squeezed it tighter. 3 feet behind him, his own name watched in glass. His name was Calvin Mercer. He was 35 years old. His badge said Contract Maintenance, Level 2. His shift began at 10 in the evening and ended at 6 in the morning. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in North Shore, 2 miles from the runway he had spent the night walking. The apartment was small, not poverty small, small the way things are when someone has made a deliberate decision about what is worth carrying. The kitchen counter held exactly 2 mugs. Above the breakfast table, pinned to the wall, was a technical drawing of a turbine cross-section. In the upper left corner of the drawing, drawn directly onto the technical lines in purple crayon, was a small flower. It had been there for 3 years. He had never taken it down. His daughter was 6. Her name was Noelle, but she had not answered to anything other than Nell, since the day she had learned to spell it. She watched things before she spoke about them. She did not feel a need to answer right away. In her left hand, every time she stepped outside the door, she carried a small piece of metal the size of a child's palm. He had machined it himself, from the last scrap of Inconel left in his home workshop, the week her mother had died. On the edge of the small turbine blade, 2 pairs of letters were filed by hand into the alloy, interlocked. CM and R. W. Nell had never asked who R.W. was. She had always known. He had once held a different job. He had once signed his name to drawings that traveled. The drawings were still traveling, he was not. His wife had wanted him home in the mornings. The mornings had been her favorite part. Before I tell you what happened when a senior corporate attorney walked across the marble at gate G12, tell me where you are listening from today, and whether anyone in your life has ever been dismissed by their coat before anyone asked their name. Drop it in the comments. Stay with me until the end. The terminal he worked in was the newest in the city. Concourse G of Meridian Airways had opened 9 winters earlier in a city that did not need another beautiful building, but had been given one anyway. Floor-to-ceiling glass on the runway side, polished marble on the gate side. At the center of the main first-class lounge, raised on a low pedestal under recessed lights, was the scale model of the engine that had carried the airline back into solvency, the WR9. Most of the passengers walked past it, the way passengers walk past anything they have not been told to look at. Calvin worked the night shift. He arrived at 10 and he left at 6. He walked the hangar on a route that had not changed in 2 years. He logged oil pressures. He confirmed serial numbers. He signed maintenance slips at the end of every shift with his initials and the date, and nothing else. The night crew called him Cal. None of them had been on the property long enough to know what the letter C on the brass plate in the lounge stood for. None of them had ever thought to ask. That morning his shift had ended 40 minutes before the first-class boarding for the 8:15 Newark flight. He had collected Nell from the airline daycare on the lower concourse, where parents who worked the property could leave their children for the final hour of a shift at no charge. He had not been planning to walk through the first-class lounge. The pedestrian route from the daycare to the long-term lot ran along the corridor outside the rope line, parallel but separate. Nell had asked to see the airplane through the windows. He had said yes. He had stopped, with his daughter holding his left hand, 6 paces from the velvet rope at gate G12. He had been planning to stay for 1 minute. He had still been planning to stay for 1 minute when he heard the agent at the gate say the word "ma'am," in the particular tone that meant the conversation that followed would not be a conversation. The agent at the gate was named Damon Ashby. He was 43 years old. He had been the head of first-class boarding at Concourse G for 6 years. He had been with Meridian for 20. He had a face that looked tired in repose and pleasant when he chose to make it so. He chose to make it. So when the passenger in front of him was wearing a suit that cost more than $3,000, he did not choose to make it so when the passenger in front of him was wearing a coat that did not. He had been trained to sort passengers by the way they walked toward him. He had been trained well. His sort, this particular morning, had taken less than 2 seconds. The coat was charcoal wool, the kind of coat that was once expensive and had since become merely warm. The suitcase was leather, scuffed at the corners, with a strap that had been replaced once by hand. The hair was silver, in a low knot at the back of the neck. There was no jewelry except a thin gold band on the left hand. There was no entourage. He had decided, before she had reached the rope, what she was. And then he had stepped into her path. He liked the word procedure. He liked it because it was a word that did the work of refusal without anyone having to be openly cruel. He used it 3 times in the first 60 seconds. Procedure, verification, premium guest experience. Each time he said it, the bars of the small invisible cage he was building around her tightened by 1 notch. He could have scanned her ticket in 3 seconds. The handheld unit on his belt would have confirmed the booking, the seat, the fare class, and the name. He chose instead to keep her standing there. He chose instead to ask her where she had purchased it. He chose instead to ask whether someone might have purchased it on her behalf, and whether she might, perhaps, have taken someone else's ticket by mistake. Several heads in the queue turned at that one. A young man near the rope leaned toward his girlfriend and whispered something that made her laugh into her hand. A businessman with a leather satchel sighed loudly, theatrically, in the direction of his watch. The agent heard the small sounds in the room and mistook them for approval. He smiled at her, and the smile did not move past his cheekbones. He had been waiting all morning for a passenger to confirm what he already believed about the world. He believed he had just found one. What the agent at the gate did not know, and what no one in the queue at gate G12 knew, was that the engine model behind the glass on the low pedestal had been designed by the man in the gray work coat, now standing 6 paces from the velvet rope. The WR9 had been Calvin Mercer's project from the spring of the year he turned 28. He had carried the design through 3 iterations and a 40-month certification cycle. He had signed his name to the final propulsion drawings in late autumn. The patent records listed 3 patents under the WR9 umbrella. On all 3, his name was the first name in the inventor column. The engine had returned Meridian Airways to fleet profitability within 14 months of its rollout. It now flew on nearly half of the airline's narrow-body aircraft. His wife had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. In the early spring of the year, he turned 31. The oncologist had given her between 9 and 15 months. She had lived 11. He had signed the final draft of his last propulsion drawing on a Tuesday afternoon in the company conference room. 6 days later, on the following Monday, she had died at home in their bedroom in North Shore, holding his left hand. He had filed his resignation that Friday. He had not stopped working. He had only changed the shape of the work. The night maintenance shift let him be at the daycare door at 6 in the morning to collect his daughter. It let him be at the kitchen table when she ate breakfast. It let him walk her to the school gate at 8:15, every weekday without exception. The engine he had drawn still ran. Its serial line was now in its 7th year of fleet service. He could still tell from 40 feet away whether the spool-up of a WR9 was running within the original specification or had drifted by 0.3% in the bearing race. Nobody in the queue at gate G12 knew that either. The elderly woman in the charcoal wool coat had stopped trying to argue. She had opened her small leather wallet and had taken out her driver's license and had offered it across the small distance between them. Her name, she said, was Eleanor Whitfield. She had bought the ticket herself. She was flying to New York on a personal trip. She added, in the same quiet voice she had used for everything else, that today was a particular day. It was the 50th anniversary of her marriage to her late husband. He had promised her, many years ago, that one day he would take her in a first-class seat to New York, and that they would walk together through Central Park while the snow was falling. He had died before he could keep the promise. She was making the trip herself, this morning, with the old suitcase the two of them had carried on every journey they had ever taken together. In another life, in another room, that story would have stopped a man like Damon Ashby in his tracks. It did not stop him. He tilted his head, the way a man tilts his head at a small inconvenience. He gave her a slow, deliberate smile. He said, loud enough for the entire line to hear, "Ma'am, I am very sorry for your loss, but a sad story does not prove that you belong in the first-class cabin." It landed the way a slap lands. Eleanor flinched once, almost imperceptibly. A woman near the front of the line laughed, then quickly covered her mouth. Calvin was watching. He had not moved. He had not spoken. He had only been standing 6 paces from the velvet rope with his daughter's hand in his. He looked down. Nell was no longer watching the man at the gate. She was looking down at her own left hand. Her small fingers had wrapped around the metal turbine blade in her fist. As the agent's words finished landing in the room, Calvin saw his daughter slowly, carefully, push the keychain deeper into the pocket of her coat, until the metal disappeared below the seam. She was learning, on a marble floor in a quiet terminal in Chicago, that there were people in the world from whom the things you loved had to be hidden. That was the moment he stepped out of the line. He did not move quickly. He had spent enough years on the property to know that quick movements made other men reach for their radios. He bent down to Nell's level. He looked into her face for the careful second that he gave to all the small decisions that involved her. He said, in the voice he used only when he was talking to her alone, "Stay where you are, sweetheart." She nodded. She did not ask why. She did not need to. He stood up. He walked the 6 paces to the rope. He did not lift the velvet barrier. He stepped around it, the way a man steps around a piece of furniture in his own house. He stopped beside Eleanor Whitfield. He stood just close enough that she could feel another body next to her. He did not touch her. He did not introduce himself. He looked at the agent at the gate. "She has a ticket," he said. "Your job is to check the ticket. It is not to check her worth through her coat." The marble in the boarding area had been engineered to absorb sound. It absorbed nothing for the next 4 seconds. Damon Ashby turned his head slowly. He took in the gray contractor's coat, the worn boots, the small girl in the corner with the keychain pocket. He let his eyes complete the inventory before he spoke. "Sir," he said, "are you also a first-class passenger?" The way he said the word "sir" made it mean its opposite. Calvin did not answer for one full breath. Then he said, "No, I am not." Damon's smile sharpened. "Then, I am going to ask you, sir, to return to your place behind the rope. This is a restricted boarding area." Calvin did not move. He said, "Even so, I have the right to ask you to treat an elderly woman with respect." Several passengers in the queue lowered their eyes. A young woman behind Eleanor, who had been standing very straight, took one small step closer to her. The way a person steps closer to a stranger, they have suddenly realized they should have stood with already. Damon shifted weight. He used the next 30 seconds to build a wall of polished words. He talked about premium guest experience. He talked about the airline's responsibility to its loyalty members. He talked about ticket fraud and about the public's failure to understand the demands of his role. Calvin watched him build it. When Damon paused, Calvin spoke very simply. "No," he said. "You are protecting your own pride." Several passengers looked away. The young man with the phone lowered it slowly to his side. The businessman, pretending to read the morning paper, let his hand drop, and the paper sagged in his lap. Damon's face did not change. The muscle at his jaw moved once, then once again. He did not move. He decided in the next 3 seconds to change the shape of his attack. He said, "Sir, can I ask your name?" Calvin said, "Mercer." Damon glanced down at the small tablet on the podium beside him. He tapped twice. The screen returned the badge record within a second. Calvin watched him read it. He watched Damon's eyes perform the small calibration that came when a man realized the person he was speaking to was even smaller than he had first calculated. "Mr. Mercer," Damon said, "your badge shows you are a contract maintenance employee on this property." He paused. He let the word contractor sit in the room for a beat. He continued, "As a contractor on Meridian property, you are subject to the airline's conduct policy at all times when you are inside the secure perimeter. I have the authority right now to revoke your gate access for the remainder of the day." A few people in the queue glanced at Calvin. The businessman with the satchel looked openly pleased. Calvin did not answer. He did not explain himself. He did not say what he had once been. "Authority used to silence other people is not authority," he said quietly. "It is the noise authority makes when it is afraid." Eleanor turned her head slightly toward him. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She had spent 50 years married to a man who used to say similar sentences in similar voices. Half a step behind the line of passengers, a woman in a black silk dress had been watching the entire scene without moving. Her name was Imogen Brace. She was 29 years old. She was the chief executive of a hospitality company that owned 5 resorts on 3 coasts. She had seen the agent lift the ticket. She had seen the queue laugh. She had seen the old woman flinch. She had watched with the detached interest her industry had taught her, as a single father in a gray work coat stepped forward where she had not. She had not, until that minute, asked herself why. She did not step forward, not yet. Damon looked toward the long corridor that led to the executive office wing. He raised his right hand and motioned once with 2 fingers. At the end of the corridor, 2 airport security officers in dark uniforms turned and began to walk toward the gate at a measured pace. Calvin watched them come. He did not move. His left hand was loose at his side. His shoulders had settled lower, not higher, the way a man's shoulders settle when he has decided to stay. Eleanor turned to him. "You do not have to do this for me," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. He looked at her. "I am not doing this because you are rich or poor," he said. "I am doing it because if I am ever the one standing alone, I would want someone to speak a fair word for me." The officers reached the gate. They looked first at Damon, who was, after all, wearing the airline's uniform. Damon spoke first. He used the language he had been trained to use. He said the elderly woman had presented a ticket of unclear ownership. He said she had refused to step aside for verification. He said an older male contractor had inserted himself into the situation. He did not say she looks poor. He did not say he is in my way. He said irregularity, verification, obstruction. The language did the work that his thoughts had been doing all morning. The older of the 2 officers looked at Calvin. Something in Calvin's face reached him in a way that uniforms usually did not. The officer turned slightly, as if to check the booking screen behind Damon. Damon spoke again, faster. "Officers," he said, "the flight is delayed. The premium passengers are starting to complain. If you do not move quickly, the responsibility for that delay will fall on the 2 of you." The older officer hesitated. "Trouble does not start when good people speak," Calvin said. "It starts when good people are convinced no one else will." He stayed where he was. Damon turned to the younger officer. He pointed across the rope to where Nell was still standing, 6 paces back, where her father had asked her to stay. He said, "And please escort the child to the family services area while we sort this out." Several things happened in the next 3 seconds. The older officer turned his head slowly toward Damon. Imogen Brace took her first small step forward and then stopped, as if surprised by her own foot. The businessman with the satchel set the satchel down on the floor. Eleanor Whitfield closed her eyes. Calvin moved. He did not move quickly. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked the 8 paces back to where his daughter was standing, and he placed himself between her and the younger of the two security officers. He did not crouch, he did not lift her. He stood at his full height with his daughter behind his right leg, the way a man stands when he has decided that the next decision in the room is going to be made through him or not at all. He looked down once. Nell was looking up. The knuckles of her left fist had gone white around the metal in her pocket. Calvin reached down with his right hand. He laid his thumb gently across the back of his daughter's fingers. Her hand slowly opened. She did not let go of the keychain. She simply stopped squeezing it. He raised his head and looked at the security officer. "She stays with me," he said. The officer stopped. He looked at Damon. He looked back at Calvin. He did not move forward. Some lines do not need to be raised to be heard. The marble was quiet. It was at that moment that the sound of new footsteps came from the long corridor that led to the executive office wing. They were quick, controlled, the kind of footsteps that men in tailored suits make when they have been instructed to hurry without losing their dignity. 3 of them came forward in identical dark suits. The man at the front carried a slim leather folio. None of them looked at Damon Ashby. They walked past him as if he were a column of air. They stopped in front of the elderly woman in the charcoal wool coat. She stayed with him. The tall, gray-haired attorney at the front of the group gave Eleanor a small, formal bow. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I apologize for the delay. The shareholder meeting you requested has been prepared according to your instructions." A silence fell over the boarding area unlike any silence that had come before. It was the silence of 100 people simultaneously rereading the last 5 minutes. Damon Ashby's mouth opened. "Mrs. Who?" he said. The attorney turned and looked at him for the first time. His voice was even and calm. "Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield," he said, "founder of Whitfield Equity Holdings, the largest individual shareholder of Meridian Airways." The young man with the phone lowered it to his side. The woman who had laughed turned her face toward the windows. The businessman who had been pretending to read the newspaper let it slide entirely from his hand and watched it drift to the floor. Damon's face went a particular shade of white that comes only when a man has already understood, in full, what he has just lost. Some silences are not silence at all. They are the sound of 100 people rereading the last 5 minutes. The attorney continued gently, as if explaining a small matter to the room. He said that Mrs. Whitfield had chosen, deliberately, to travel without a security detail and without an entourage on this particular flight. This trip was a private one. It was a trip of remembrance. The coat she wore had been bought for her by her late husband during their first winter together in Chicago, more than 50 years ago. The suitcase she carried had traveled with the 2 of them on their first journey as a married couple. She had not been hiding her wealth. She had been carrying her marriage. Everything Damon had read as poverty had been, instead, the most precious thing she owned. Eleanor reached out and took her boarding pass back from Damon's hand. Her fingers still trembled slightly. They no longer trembled from fear. Damon began to stammer. He used the word misunderstanding. He used the word procedure. The words had lost their power. Every passenger in the queue had heard him say, only minutes earlier, that a sad story did not prove she belonged in first class. The room had not forgotten. "You did not doubt my ticket," Eleanor said, in the same quiet voice she had used since the beginning. "You doubted my dignity because I did not look like the kind of person you wanted to serve." Damon lowered his head. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I deeply apologize. I was only trying to protect the integrity of the first-class experience." "No," she said, "you used procedure to hide your prejudice." Within a minute, a senior customer relations representative of Meridian Airways arrived at the gate, breathless, with 2 assistants behind him. He began at once to apologize. He used the words companies use when they have something to lose. He said the airline would investigate internally. He said Mrs. Whitfield would receive every possible courtesy. Eleanor listened to him for a moment. Then she quietly cut his sentence in half. "I do not want a bouquet of apologies," she said. "I want to know how many people without my money, without my attorney, and without my shares in this airline have been treated the way I was treated today." The senior representative did not have an answer for that. He began another sentence. She raised one finger and let it rest in the air, and the sentence stopped. She turned her head slowly toward Calvin Mercer, who was still standing in front of his daughter at the back of the rope line. She looked back at the senior representative. "While you are here, sir," she said, "may I ask you a question?" "Of course, ma'am. Do you, by any chance, employ a propulsion engineer named Calvin Mercer?" The senior representative did not answer immediately. He looked across the small distance between them at the man in the gray contractor's coat. He paused for what felt like a full breath. Then he said slowly, in a voice loud enough for the entire boarding area to hear, "He was our chief propulsion engineer." The marble was quiet again. Damon Ashby's head turned, slowly, all the way around, until he was looking directly at Calvin for what felt like the first time. He had walked past the same man on the same concourse for nearly 4 years. He had never once looked at him. A signature does not need to be loud. It only needs to be where the metal was. Eleanor turned again to the senior representative and said, "Thank you," in the way a woman thanks a man who has just confirmed something she already suspected. She looked once at Calvin. He met her eyes for half a second and then looked down at his daughter, who was still standing behind his right leg, her small hand still wrapped quietly around the metal in her pocket. Nell let go of his hand. Calvin felt the small fingers slide out of his. He looked down, but she was already walking. She walked the slow, careful walk of a 6-year-old on a particular errand. She walked past Imogen Brace. She walked past the businessman with the leather satchel. She walked past the velvet rope, which was still cordoning off a queue that had stopped pretending to be a queue. She walked across the polished marble of the first-class lounge, and not one of the 72 people in the gate area thought to stop her. She stopped in front of the glass case at the center of the lounge. She stood at her full height of 41 inches, which still left her 2 inches short of the lip of the pedestal. She went up on her toes. She raised her right index finger and pointed at the brass plate at the base of the engine model. She pointed at the line that read, "Lead Design Engineer, C. Mercer." She did not say anything. She did not look back at her father. She simply pointed. For a long moment, nobody in the lounge moved. The young man with the phone slowly raised it again, but not to film. He held it in front of him as if he had only just realized that he did not need to. The businessman with the satchel turned his head, then his shoulders, then his entire body in the direction of the glass case. Imogen Brace put one hand to her mouth and the other hand to her chest and did not move it. The senior customer relations representative of Meridian Airways looked at the small girl, then at the plate behind the glass, then at Calvin. He blinked twice. He had read that plate once during his orientation tour 6 years ago. He had not read it since. A 6-year-old in a winter coat had just read it for him. She kept pointing for another 3 seconds. Then she lowered her arm and walked back across the marble to her father. She did not speak. The 2 security officers, the older one first, turned away from Calvin and Nell and walked back to the corridor they had come from. The younger one did not look at Damon as he passed. Damon Ashby's badge was taken from him at the gate, in front of the line of passengers he had been trying all morning to impress. The senior representative made the request himself, quietly, professionally, and entirely without sympathy. Damon walked past the velvet rope and did not look at the queue as he went. The senior representative did not return to his rehearsed apology. He turned to Eleanor and asked, simply, what she wanted to do. Eleanor instructed her attorney to record the incident formally. She asked for the security footage to be preserved. She asked, in the same quiet voice she had been using all morning, for the names of any other passengers who had filed complaints about premium service discrimination in the previous 5 years. The senior representative said, "Of course, Mrs. Whitfield." He did not pretend to know the number. A few of the passengers who had laughed earlier stepped forward to apologize to Eleanor. A man with a small gold pin on his lapel said, "Ma'am, I am sorry. I should not have smiled." Eleanor looked at him gently. "Do not apologize to me because I turned out to be wealthy," she said. "Apologize to the next person you would have looked down on if you thought they were poor." He had nothing to say to that. Imogen Brace stepped out of the line. Her heels clicked softly on the marble. She stopped in front of Eleanor first. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "I owe you an apology as well. I saw everything from the rope. I had the voice. I had the standing. I chose to be quiet." Eleanor regarded her for a long moment. "Power does not raise people higher," she said. "It only makes their silence heavier." Imogen nodded, accepting it. She did not try to soften it. She said that she would establish, within her hospitality company, a public initiative against discriminatory treatment in luxury service. She said she would make her own previous silence part of the conversation, in a documented way. Eleanor walked across the marble to one of the small leather chairs along the windows. She sat down, slowly, and arranged the old wool coat across her knees. Nell walked to her. Calvin watched from where he stood. He did not move. The small girl stopped in front of the elderly woman. She looked into her face the way she had looked at her father 2 minutes earlier in the queue. Eleanor lowered herself to Nell's eye level, her hands on the leather arms of the chair. For a moment neither of them said anything. Then Nell said, in a voice that was quiet but very clear, "He doesn't tell people, but the engines remember." Eleanor did not answer right away. She held out her open hand, palm upward. Nell, after a small pause, reached into her left pocket and took out the metal keychain. She placed it carefully in the older woman's palm. Eleanor closed her fingers around it. She held it for 3 seconds. She did not look at it. She felt the edge where the 2 pairs of letters had been filed by hand. She opened her palm and gave the keychain back. Some things cannot be misplaced. They stay in the hand that knew them first. Before Damon Ashby was escorted from the gate, he stopped at the velvet rope. He looked across the marble at Calvin. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I deeply apologize." Calvin looked at him. "I accept that," he said. He did not add anything. He did not attach conditions. He did not perform forgiveness. He turned back to his daughter, and he reached down and he straightened the collar of her winter coat, the way he had straightened it every morning of her life since she had been 3 years old. That was the whole apology. 2 weeks later, the senior customer relations representative of Meridian Airways visited Calvin Mercer at his apartment in North Shore. He brought in a leather folio of the same kind the attorney had been carrying that morning at the gate, a contract for the position of chief propulsion engineer. The salary was high. The corner office was real. The title was the one he had given up 4 years earlier. Calvin read the offer carefully. He drank his coffee while he read it. He did not say anything for nearly 10 minutes. Then he handed it back across the kitchen table. He took a different contract instead. A consulting role, 3 days a week, 9 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. A small office at the end of the corridor on Concourse G, with a window that looked down onto the assembly floor. Where the engines he had once drawn were now being built by the next generation of engineers. He could drop Nell off at school at 8:15 every weekday. He could pick her up at 2:30. That was the entire requirement. That was the whole reason. On the following Saturday morning, Calvin pinned a new technical drawing to the wall above the breakfast table. Nell climbed onto the kitchen chair with her box of crayons. She drew a small purple flower in the upper left corner of the new drawing, in the same place she had drawn one on the old. She did not ask if it was allowed. She had simply decided that it belonged there. Calvin did not take it down. He did not take the old one down either. Both drawings stayed on the wall. A week after the morning at gate G12, Nell found an envelope in the mailbox. There was no return address. Inside was a single postcard. On the front, drawn in soft pencil by a hand that was clearly not a child's, was a small turbine blade. It was the kind of drawing a person makes when they have been holding a particular small object in their hand earlier in the week. Nell did not ask her father who had sent it. She taped it to the front of the refrigerator at the height of her own eyes. 90 days after the morning at the gate, Imogen Brace's initiative against discrimination in luxury service launched at a press event in Midtown Manhattan. Her opening sentence was reported in 7 newspapers the following day. The elderly woman they refused first class that morning, she said, was not the only person being tested. Some signatures cannot be moved. They stay on the metal whether anyone looks for them or not. He had not been hiding his name. He had been carrying his wife. Calvin Mercer did not earn his first-class seat with a fortune. He earned it the way men still earn it, when no one is watching, by stepping out of a quiet line on a quiet morning. For a stranger, he had no reason to know. The keychain in his daughter's pocket weighed less than 2 ounces. It carried, instead, everything he had ever signed his name to. Looking back, the thing that changed everything at Gate G12 was not the moment a senior corporate attorney walked across the marble. It was not the moment a brass plate behind glass was finally read out loud by a 6-year-old. It was the moment a man in a contractor's coat decided he could no longer stay in a quiet line for a story he could no longer watch. The difference between dignity and humiliation is often nothing more than the willingness of one person in the room to stop being polite about the wrong thing. A uniform exercises authority. A heart exercises judgment. They are not the same instrument, and rooms that confuse the two pay the price for years afterward. Some names cannot be taken. They can be temporarily unread by people who walked past the metal without looking. They can be filed quietly into the alloy by a father who has decided that his daughter will, one day, know exactly whose hand made the thing she has been carrying in her pocket all her life. They stay where they are underneath. They wait, patient and unhurried, to be called on. The signature on the engine outlasts the agent at the gate. The hand of the father outlasts the politeness of the line. If you had been standing in that line, would you have stepped out for the woman in the worn coat? Or would you have stayed in your place for the flight you had paid for? Our team works hard to create stories dramatic enough to entertain, but meaningful enough to leave a lasting message. Everything in this video is completely fictional and was created only to share meaningful lessons through an entertaining story. We hope it encourages you to value what is real, look past the surface of the people around you, and never let a first impression write the final word on anyone's worth.